All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Rob Kuhns. Rob is the director of the new documentary film, Birth of the Living Dead, which discusses the making of the zombie horror film classic, Night of the Living Dead. You can find it at yearofTheLivingDead.com. Rob, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's great to be here, Matt. Thank you.
All right, so Rob, before we get to talking about your documentary, which is a really, really great documentary, I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
You're a big Romero fan. You made a documentary about Romero here. One thing I always like to do when I find other Romero fans is actually ask them to rank their favorite Romero zombie films, and so just tell me what are your top? He has 6 of them. How do you rank them in order of your favorites?
I'd say I'd have to put. I mean, a lot of it might have to do with the fact that we've studied Night so closely, but I'd probably put Night at number one. But before really examining Night, Dawn was my favorite. So it might be a tie, but it's probably Night first and then Dawn. Then it gets tougher to judge between Day, Survival Diary, and Land. It's and I haven't seen Day in quite a while, but of course the big thing of that is I don't think those gore effects have ever been surpassed in anything.
Right.
So that's really an extraordinary aspect of Day of the Dead. It's a tough call. I like them all for different reasons, so I prefer kind of not to put them in a hierarchy beyond my top two. But there are things to love about all of them. I mean, in Land, one of my favorite moments, I think that one's underrated, frankly, but one of my favorite moments is when John Leguizamo, he's finally got the money to buy into Fiddler's Green, the condo, and so he's ready to move in. He's made it to the top, and so he tells Dennis Hopper, who's the chief of the condo, I'm ready to move in. He says, "Well," and Hopper goes, "Well, I have to talk it over with the board. It's not really a done deal." It's like, you're a Puerto Rican, man. Of course they're not going to let you into this condo. You're like below them. So it's just the whole class war structure of Land of the Dead just was very, very satisfying to me.
Yeah. Okay. So my top is Dawn, just because it's just because it's so amazingly well done, and just the fact the whole criticism of consumer culture and capitalism. Mine's Dawn, followed by Night, and then I'm actually gonna go. I actually go Land, and that's pretty controversial for a lot of Romero people. A lot of people go Dawn, Night, Day, but Land has actually come ahead of me as far as Day goes, and I still love Day of the Dead, but Land, just because it's such an amazing class warfare movie, actually jumped ahead of Day, which is obviously a big military industrial complex criticism and stuff. But cool. All right. Interesting. All right. So okay, I think I got a good grasp of where you're coming from. So let's talk about your film. So you're a big fan. What actually made you decide to make a movie to make Birth of the Living Dead? What was the crux? Was it just your basic giant enjoyment of the film, but what actually made you want to make a whole movie on it?
Well, the initial interest was in reading about the making of the film, which was just this wonderful underdog story, of a little movie that could, out of Pittsburgh, and one of the first, the idea of an independent film was pretty new back then. I mean, John Cassavetes had made a couple of films, and and I guess there was Carnival of Souls and a couple of other independent films. But this was an extraordinary thing for these people to pull off. And so, as a filmmaker, I just found myself really inspired by the fact that these people, just mostly out of pure creativity, inventiveness, and sweat equity, were able to pull off such an incredible feat. And
talk about how kind of like, because it's really interesting how much of the original Night of the Living Dead was actually made by Romero and a bunch of his friends, but also this sort of entire Pennsylvania community pretty much made this classic horror film.
Yeah. And I was asked for the Pittsburgh Tribune, and he asked me a question which I hadn't been asked before, and so it was really an interesting question. Is there something specifically about Pittsburgh, where something like this could happen? And I think that maybe kind of the underdog identity and the sense that we could do something like this and galvanize, I think did help with the film, and And the characters, I mean, people like Vince Stravinsky, that's just, I mean, what a wonderful character. I really wish, I was so disappointed to hear that he had died before, even thinking of the idea, because to interview him just would have been unbelievable. He was a roller rink owner who was in his 50s, who got connected with Romero and his friends, and, just wanted to get in the movie business. And so he plunked down $10,000 of his own money and to buy into, Romero was like 27 at the time, to buy into this young company, and just threw his heart and soul into this project. I mean, he basically, in terms of the logistics and the sheer weightlifting, he carried the project like on his back, and I just found that such a wonderful story, and just everybody just worked so hard to make this thing happen and come out as great as it did.
Interesting. Again, I'm talking to Rob Kuhns, director of the documentary Birth of the Living Dead. You can find it at yearofTheLivingDead.com. Let's talk a little bit about more so, a little more obviously in his later films, became a little more obviously satirical, especially kind of pretty much starting with Dawn. But Night of the Living Dead is actually a very, very radical film when you actually look at a lot of the politics that's presented in there. And in your film, you actually kind of discuss how much that movie is a reflection of the politics of the time, which the film was made in 1968. So tell us about that aspect of it.
I think the thing that was one of the things that was so radical about the film, as you say, is it was so... I like to look at this film as being kind of a working class cousin of Bonnie and Clyde or The Graduate, which came out in '67, which were really radical movies, completely different kind of storytelling in movies. And it questioned basically everything. It's such an anti-establishment movie, and I love the fact that it kind of came right at the beginning, kind of right at the dawn of all the great movies that came out in the '70s out of Hollywood. The so-called directors-driven movies like, and actually starting in the late '60s, like Midnight Cowboy, The Last Detail, Chinatown, The Godfathers. The list goes really on and on. It was that happens to be my favorite era of filmmaking, is which I have in common with many, many people. I just love that time. And Night came right at the beginning of that, so it was really at the vanguard, of making such a big change in storytelling and filmmaking, and the fact that in the process of making the film, that was not an original. That didn't come like with the concept of making this film. That kind of happened in the process of making the documentary. I worked for Bill Moyers on a show called Moyers and Company, and before that on a show called Bill Moyers Journal. And Bill was the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson at the time that Night of the Living Dead was made. And so, and he frequently talks about that time in essays and in his interviews. And so I was kind of steeped in that part of history and that footage, the footage of Vietnam, the footage of the race rebellions that were happening at the time. And those race rebellions that were happening in Newark and Detroit and really all across the country were happening while they were shooting Night of the Living Dead. And so just to give one example, footage of National Guardsmen coming out on the street and shooting people was coming out just as they were shooting Night of the Living Dead, where you had the posse going out and shooting zombies, Yeah. And the parallel was just so striking, that it just, this is a really interesting angle. And as it turned out, I was talking about Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. Those were nominated for an Academy Award in 1968. Mark Harris, who we interviewed for the film, wrote this book called Pictures at a Revolution, which was about the films that were nominated for the Academy Award in 1968, and set it in the socio-political context, set all those films within that time. And so I was able to really just kind of lift so much of Mark's research too, and place it in the film. And the fact that we got to interview him was just fantastic. And he was really eager to speak about that time, to speak about Night.